Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, said this of the Industrial Revolution.
The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor?
What was it about England that after centuries of slow economic change made industrialization and growth possible on a scale and at a tempo quite different from all previous experience? This is the question we shall answer in the second film of our series. Why did the Industrial Revolution occur where and when it did in England in the 18th century? Why was England the first country to industrialize? Other European economies had impressive economic expansions before England: France, Holland, Spain, and Portugal, but none had resulted in industrialization. France was the most powerful nation in Europe in the century before the Industrial Revolution. So why had France not industrialized before England? We asked Professor Ronald Coase, formerly of the London School of Economics and now of the University of Chicago, for his view.
I think that Adam Smith had the explanation. It was his view, and he'd studied the economic development of many countries, including France, that the constitution and institutions of a nation had a decisive effect on its ability to create wealth. The economy that prospered, according to Smith, was one in which there existed the obvious and simple system of natural liberty, and in which people could feel secure in the possession of their property. As regards England, he was quite explicit about the reasons for her prosperity. Individual effort in a context of freedom and the rule of law. As Adam Smith wrote,
though the profession of government must undoubtedly have retarded the natural progress of England towards wealth and improvement, it has not been able to stop it. In the midst of all the exactions of government, this capital has been silently and gradually accumulated by private frugality and good conduct of individuals, by their universal, continual, and uninterrupted effort to better their own condition. It is this effort, protected by law and allowed by liberty to exert itself in the manner that is most advantageous, which has maintained the progress of England towards opulence and improvement.
The growth of liberty, political, social, economic, and intellectual, emancipated Englishmen from the bonds of command and custom, and set free their inventive and innovating energy, especially in business. The consequences of freedom for the economy were more beneficial, Smith argued, than the consequences of mercantilism, that system of patronage and control by the state which then prevailed in Europe. The more successful industrial and commercial development of England was largely spontaneous, the cumulative result of the uncoordinated acts of individuals acting freely in their own interests. There was some government patronage, for example, in foreign trade, where monopolies were granted to companies like the East India Company. But generally speaking, in England by the 18th century, businesses were established by individual entrepreneurs, and it was the market that determined their profitability and hence their survival. In all this, the state took no direct part.
Freedom of enterprise depended not only upon constitutional and legal guarantees, but also on a social and political environment that in every way was increasingly favorable to individualism. Political unity, political stability, and the rule of law, characteristics of English society which were achieved by the 18th century, all made for an environment with greater security and greater freedom for person and property than elsewhere in Europe. England also had a flexible social system that was not too exclusive and allowed individuals of talent to advance both economically and socially. Social mobility was not obstructed significantly by aristocratic, religious, or racial barriers. As Daniel Defoe pointed out,
trade in England makes a gentleman, for after a generation or two, the tradesmen's children, or at least their grandchildren, come to be good gentlemen.
As greater numbers of people had more chance to advance themselves, incentives to work were encouraged, wealth increased and became more widely dispersed, more capital was accumulated, and a larger market for industrial goods was created. A comparison with other countries underlines England's advantage for leadership in industrialization, as Professor Max Hartwell of the University of Oxford explains.
Compared with Europe generally, English industry in the 18th century was free, whereas much European industrial effort was the responsibility of absolute monarchs aimed at conspicuous consumption or at increasing the power of the state. Already in England, industrial effort was aimed at a broadly based market in which demand reflected a wide variety of tastes and incomes, and in which the role of government was neither very large nor very influential. Compared with France and Italy, England had a less restrictive social system, less ostentatious wealth, less aristocratic privilege of the type dispersed here at Versailles, and less abject poverty. Compared with Italy and Germany, England had politically the advantage of national unity, and economically the advantages of an integrated market, a uniform currency, and freedom from internal customs barriers. A more detailed comparison with France underlines England's economic advantages over Europe's most powerful nation. During the first half of the 18th century, the progress of France in many ways resembled that of England. France was a larger country than England and had a larger population. It had a notable culture, both literary and scientific. It had a powerful state and a brilliant court centered here at Versailles. Politically, France dominated and was considered to be the most powerful nation of Europe. Economic comparisons also give a favorable impression of French achievement, even though in significant areas English progress was greater. Total production, industrially and agriculturally, was greater in France, although industrial productivity per worker was higher in England. In the iron, coal and textile industries, there were important differences. French iron production was greater, but coal production was much less than in England. French textile production increased as fast as did English production, but not in cotton goods. French foreign trade, with the advantages of easy access to Europe and of a large empire, enjoyed the same rate of growth as English trade. French scientific achievement was at least as good as that of England, and French thinkers provided the intellectual stimulus for the Enlightenment, that revolution in attitudes towards man and society that heralded the beginning of the modern world. In 1760, France, like England, seemed poised for industrialization, but thereafter England grew steadily ahead. By the end of the century, the economic gap between France and England was widening, with war dominating the French economy. What caused this difference? French economic progress in the 18th century did not result in an industrial revolution as in England, because France's economic, political, social and constitutional framework gave less scope to that individual enterprise which characterized England of the same period. In French industry and commerce, the state dominated. Over overseas trade, for example, was largely controlled by state-chartered monopolies, which created enormous fortunes, but for very few people, and which inhibited the growth of a class of overseas merchants. In industry, state ownership or support created a hierarchy of manufacturing concerns according to the degree of government patronage. Industries with government patronage thrived, and some of the largest, like those making Gobelin tapestries or Sèvres porcelain, were state factories producing for a limited aristocratic and not for a mass market. Industrial growth in France, therefore, did not benefit the mass of the population, whose continuing poverty prevented the growth of consumer-oriented industries like the English cotton industry. In France also, the strength of the guilds with their restrictive practices had survived from the Middle Ages, further restraining enterprise and innovation. Economic weakness was reinforced by social prejudice. In France, society was dominated by its landed and court aristocracy. The businessman was low in the social scale and had neither the opportunity nor the influence to change the conditions in which he worked.
England, in contrast, had a social and institutional framework that was suitable for economic initiative. She had, in consequence, a relatively advanced economy in which farmers and businessmen could flourish, even before the Industrial Revolution. By 1750, there was already widespread economic change in agriculture and in industry, in commerce and in communications. This meant that society and economy were flexible enough to respond to the greater demands of the Industrial Revolution. This can be seen clearly, for example, in the case of agriculture. Agricultural advance was basic to and preceded industrial advance. More food and raw materials had to be produced before men and resources could be released for industrial enterprise. And so industrialization was preceded by an agricultural revolution, which had many of the characteristics of the later Industrial Revolution, particularly technological innovations and organizational change. Technological change took many forms. New fodder crops, like the turnip, new agricultural machinery, like the scythe and the seed drill, improved farm animals, like the Leicester and the South Down, better drainage, as in the Great Fens, and the rotation of crops to eliminate large areas of fallow, as in the Norfolk system. Organizational change took the form mainly of the enclosure of wastes, commons, and open fields to allow the formation of individual farms. The last great enclosure movement, between 1760 and 1815, led to the disappearance of the open fields and communal farming. This movement occurred during the critical years of the Industrial Revolution and coincided with a period of notable technological change. The result was, for example, that wheat yields doubled, and Britain was able to feed herself in spite of a rapidly growing population. Up to 1830, Britain was largely self-sufficient in grain and other common foodstuffs. Agriculture had successfully coped with the demands of a growing industry and a growing population, in spite of the complications of a major war and an economic blockade. This adaptability was a characteristic also of industry and of commerce, and can be seen in an important sense as the successful response to the demands of an improving market system.
In England, businessmen who anticipated and responded to market forces made profits and so had the incentive to increase production. Not only were producers rewarded, but consumers were offered a variety of things to buy, and hence had the desire to earn and therefore to work. Profits and wages both rose, generating a continuous momentum for economic change and for growth. This is what was happening in England in the period before and during the Industrial Revolution. The expansion of the market and its effectiveness can be measured by the greater mobility of people, goods, raw materials and information, and by the size of a growing urban and mercantile community.
Before the Industrial Revolution, the long haulage of bulk goods was difficult and expensive, although in the 18th century there was increasing use of river and coastal navigation. By 1750 there were about 1,000 miles of navigable waterways in England, and already road transport was being improved by the use of turnpike roads, of which about 3,000 miles were in operation. The use of the wagon and the stagecoach increased remarkably, and both land and water vehicles were larger and more specialized by 1760. By this date also, the first canal had been built at St Helens in Lancashire in 1757. After 1760, growth was rapid. By 1770, there were 13,000 miles of turnpike roads, and by 1800, 3,000 miles of canals. In consequence, all transit charges fell, and by 1800, England's transport network linked all the main industrial areas with the coal and iron fields, the towns and cities, the ports and the agricultural hinterland. A specialized class of agents and carriers had emerged, operating scheduled lines of road vehicles for both goods and people. Canal companies also developed schedules of movements and rates with a great deal of competition. Growth of the system continued apace after 1800. By 1850, in addition to 4,000 miles of canals, there were also 6,000 miles of railways. By 1850, England, Wales and Scotland had a comprehensive transport network linking even the remotest parts of the country. The transport age had arrived. The development of road, river and canal transport during the 18th century eased the movement of goods and people. The development of towns, especially in the North and Midlands, reflected this easier mobility and also the sensitivity of labour to wage incentives. Wages in the towns and in counties like Lancashire were higher than in the countryside and in counties like Devon. Thus, the new industrial areas were able to attract labour and to expand. By 1760, cities like Leeds, Manchester and Birmingham were growing rapidly. Goods flowed similarly to developing commercial centres, so that there was a concentration of trade in the most conveniently located ports and inland markets. London, Bristol and Liverpool, for example, became wholesale centres with large warehousing facilities and a growing mercantile community. Consumers were better served, both in the regularity of services and in the responsiveness of producers to their changing tastes and demands. England was becoming a nation of shopkeepers. The merchants were a growing proportion of a growing population. Between 1650 and 1750, for example, their numbers increased 3 to 6 times more quickly than did total population. Fairs and local markets declined, and distribution based on permanent wholesale and retail houses became common. Nothing was more characteristic of the 18th century than the growing complexity of the market and the multiplication of middlemen. In the cotton industry, where foreign trade was important, the merchant played a key role from the beginning. The cotton industry expanded rapidly after 1780, the prototype of factory production. From 1780 to 1800, the main demand for cottons came from the working and middle classes, with female demand dominating. The large domestic servant class, farm and factory labourers, as well as the growing middle classes, now purchased pure cottons when once they purchased linens, woolens and mixed fabrics. And after 1800, all social classes wore cotton. Although the bulk demand for cheap cottons remained, along with an increasing demand for better cottons like muslins. There was at the same time an increasing export trade which soon ended the centuries-old dominance of the English export trade by woolens. This rapid growth depended on a complex marketing system in which the large cotton merchant played a vital role. In London, the so-called linen houses were stocking large quantities of Lancashire cottons for domestic and foreign sale by the 1780s. Such wholesalers had the important functions of anticipating demand, whether from fluctuations in trade or in taste, and of providing credit for both manufacturers and retailers. They had to be, in consequence, men of considerable capital, taking considerable risks. And although less praised in the annals of the Industrial Revolution than the manufacturers, their role was a significant one. During the Industrial Revolution, Britain earned the reputation of being a nation of shopkeepers and of having become the workshop of the world. The two were intimately related. Britain needed a nation of shopkeepers in order to sell the products of its workshop of the world.
Commerce thrived only when there had been a significant relaxing in the 17th and 18th centuries of the rules and regulations of a mercantilist state. Economic freedom was not all that mattered. It was the establishment of a society in which there was greater personal freedom in wide areas of human activity that provided the environment in which business enterprise could flourish. In the long run, this increasing freedom resulted in the growth of political democracy and a free market economy. On the political level, it was the struggle between king and parliament in the 17th century, in which Parliament triumphed, that ensured the representative, pluralist and decentralized character of English government, as against the autocratic and centralizing ambitions of Charles I and James II. On the economic level, it was the decline of mercantilism that led to the emergence of the market as the dominant force directing the economy.
The historians have pictured quite correctly this struggle to establish political rights as a reaction against political autocracy. And the moves in the 17th and 18th centuries against the mercantilist economy have been seen also quite correctly as reactions against the economic autocracy of government. Both political and economic agitation for increased individual freedom took the form of arguing for the removal of the government's restraints on individual action. Greater personal liberty was demanded in all aspects of life, in religious and social endeavor as well as in political and economic enterprise. In 1600, the restraints on the individual in England, political, social, economic, intellectual and religious, were formidable. But over the next 2 centuries, these restrictions were gradually lifted, so that by 1800, a wide range of rights had been secured by an increasing proportion of an increasing population. For example, the establishment of political rights in the 17th century made the attainment of economic rights easier in the 18th century. And this gaining of economic rights in the 18th century, in turn, made the further extension of political rights easier in the 19th century.
If England was earlier than other European countries in establishing individual rights, it was partly as a result of the nature of her legal institutions and laws. As Lord Mansfield, Chief Justice of the King's Bench between 1756 and 1786 argued,
The law of merchants and the law of the land is the same.
the approach of judges to mercantile cases was practical, to solve problems and settle grievances and claims as they came up in business life. English law, because of this common sense approach, was in process of continuous revision, not as the result of the decisions of kings or governments, but in response to changing economic and social circumstances as reflected in the courts. This flexibility meant that English common law was able to cope with the legal problems caused by economic growth before and during the Industrial Revolution.
These political and legal developments, which favored individualism, were reinforced by the influential writings of social theorists, in particular the economist Adam Smith and the political philosopher John Locke. Locke emphasized the rights of private property and the need for its legal protection, and the necessity of upholding the rule of law. Adam Smith attacked the state-regulated economy of mercantilism and provided the inspiration and arguments for laissez-faire. Because England had a relatively liberal environment before other countries, she was the first country able to industrialize. By the 18th century, the rights of the individual had been extended sufficiently to permit an extraordinary release of creative energy. The individual Englishman was free to innovate, free to create, and free to develop business enterprises without hindrance from government and with the protection of the law. As the barriers to individual enterprise were lowered, social and economic mobility became easier, and businessmen were able, towards the end of the 18th century, to launch the Industrial Revolution. The social consequences of this historic transformation is the subject of the third and final film in our series.